So, a very warm welcome to this, I think, 74th edition of Europe Calling, the webinar series which brings European politics closer to the citizens, this time in a very special edition. First, it is in cooperation with Anna Cavazzini, chair of the Common Market, Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee of the Parliament, and an MEP from Saxony. And also an even more warm welcome to the much missed colleague Molly Scott Cato, professor for green economics, and was with me on the Econ Committee of the Parliament and is one of the direct victims of Brexit, as we all are. And of course, we thank in particular René Repasi, professor, top expert for EU constitutional law at the Erasmus University. This time I tried to get it right, in Rotterdam, right? Yeah, last time it was wrong. So now, please choose your language under translation or Dolmetschen, so that you can enjoy the simultaneous translation. I thank warmly all staff who helped, but in particular those who have a hard job tonight translating us simultaneously. Well, obviously, we were really surprised having 2,500 registrations. We thought we are all fed up with Brexit and that's it now. But in fact, we have now a big vote ahead of us in the Parliament. And this is whether or not to ratify the so-called Brexit Deal or EU-UK trade agreement. It's one of the many trade agreements Anna and also myself and at the time Molly had to deal with. And therefore, we are in particular honored to have a thorough legal analysis of that deal. What does it mean for our common future? What does it mean for the Europe's legal order, for the common market? What does it mean for citizens and enterprises? Obviously, nearly 1,300 pages plus additional pages. This is not something which every citizen will have as a dinner lecture. So therefore, it's even better to have René. So now what we will do tonight is the following. René will give us a talk and a systematic introduction into the whole thing. You can ask your questions by typing your questions into F&A or Q&A. And now we need your help. We have so many participants. This means please help us reading these questions of everyone, also those questions which come later, and give the most important ones in your eye a like. And by that way, we can ensure, and we have had very good experience with this in the past, that the most important questions are actually tackled. You can also raise your hand with a hand signal in order to get the floor later on, but we will concentrate really on the written questions. In order to ask them and in order to like the questions of other listeners, you have to be in the system, and all others can very well watch on YouTube, which can you switch to with the link at the top of the page. So during the discussion, you will hear from Molly, you will hear from Anna, from myself, on some aspects. But now I'm really curious to listen to René. But first I hand over to Molly because we have lots of participants from the UK whom we invited particularly in order to set a clear signal. Brexit will never end our friendship. It will never end our cooperation. Our ties are much stronger than Johnson and his Brexiteers, and we will continue. And that is really the signal also of that evening. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sven. And my job is really just to welcome you here, German participants, English participants, all European and global participants. I don't know where you're all from, But I wanted to welcome you by saying, hello, Glastonbury. And that's because this is the second biggest crowd I've ever addressed in my life. And the first one was at Glastonbury. And hopefully that will remind you that although we're all in our separate places, by the summer, we'll all be sitting in a field somewhere listening to some great music. I'm 100% convinced that's true. And I wanted to start off with a joke just to convince you that even though we're heartbroken about Brexit, we haven't lost our sense of humour, not entirely. But I've got two serious things to say. The first one is, if you look at what's happening in Washington today and yesterday, you see what happens if you ignore threats to democracy and the rule of law. And it's very clear that Trump and Brexit are two sides of the same coin. And my German friends in the European Parliament understood very clearly that Brexit was an attack on the European Union and an attack on the rule of law. And I think we've seen that very clearly in the way the deal was negotiated and the way it's been so-called scrutinised by the British Parliament. In other words, 1,200 pages, arrives on Christmas Eve. You have 4 hours to debate and agree it. It's an absolute disgrace. Nobody has actually studied it in detail, and I certainly haven't read it all, and that's why I'm delighted I'm going to have all the detail from René. But of course, it's already been through our Parliament, and I'm very pleased to say that the European Parliament is doing a proper scrutiny job in as much as the British negotiators and Johnson have allowed that to be possible. And what I'm hoping to learn as a result of this evening is about the level playing field and to what extent that does in fact protect our environment, and also how the threats from the UK to turn us into a more of a tax haven than we are already. Is there any protection against that? I'm getting my questions in early using a welcoming prerogative here. But the other thing I wanted to say is a big thank you to both Sven and Anna for inviting me to co-host this evening, because it's easy in Britain at the moment to feel isolated and to feel left aside. And I so much appreciate the way German colleagues are continuing to include us, because of course, more than half the country didn't want Brexit to happen, and we feel strongly that we're still European. And I also wanted to say how much I appreciate the continuing German commitment to democracy. And it's something I didn't really know until I was an MEP, but the really studied commitment to European values and to democracy has impressed me so much, and it's continuing beyond Brexit, and you're proving that we are stronger than Brexit. So thank you for that. So I think it's my job to pass over to René, right? Or are you going to do that, Sven?
I have to say one thing which I forgot, and please start tweeting. If you hear interesting things, please start spreading it on social media and use the hashtag understanding Brexit. And that is, you will get the hashtag also on the chat now. And we invite everybody to share what you are hearing here in order to give it even more of distribution. Lastly, all this is registered and recorded. So this means if you are raising your voice, please keep in mind it will be later available for everybody to watch. And you will get the link by email so that you can share it as well. And lastly, now we are nearly at the borderline of what this webinar space can take. Everybody who doesn't need translation, either in German or English, and knows already that you will not ask a question, you can now click on the YouTube link on the top so that new people can arrive. But now over to René, we've talked enough. Thank you. René.
All right. Thanks a lot. Since everything was in English, I want to make the transition smoothly by starting in English, but the arrangement that we had is that I'm going to continue talking in German, which is my mother tongue. And we do have interpretation here. So in that sense, all good. But nevertheless, there will also be PowerPoint slides. Those slides, however, will be in English. So I'm going to have a bilingual effort with English slides and German explanations. Und vor dem Hintergrund werde ich dann jetzt die Sprache wechseln.
Let me start. I will now switch to German, my mother tongue. But I prepared the slide in English. So this is typical for Europe, really. We work in English, we have all the technical terms in English, and now I've got slides that are in English as well. And hopefully I will still be able to remember the technical terms in German. Please excuse me if I use some Anglicisms here and there. Thank you very much for the introductory remarks from both of you. And for the opportunity to talk to you here. Understanding Brexit, that's a very fitting hashtag here. At least you will get maximum attention. However, I don't want to state that we will have a final understanding of these 1,400 or 500 pages. It is a highly complicated legal text with cross-references and so on, with very detailed rules, special rules and evolving rules which might change in the future. So, well, let's see how we can get a first idea of this. However, first idea of what Brexit is would be quite a bad hashtag. So let's stick to understanding Brexit. That was just a little disclaimer. So this is my presentation. Hopefully you are all able to see it here on the screen. And yeah, I gave the same title, Understanding the Brexit Deal, to this presentation. But obviously, it is a huge topic. It is a huge document, the deal, the agreement. And obviously, I don't want to be having a monologue for the next 2 hours. I would just like to provide you with some introductory remarks, maybe draw your attention to some difficult issues or some important issues here. As a first step, members of the European Parliament, the party group of the Greens will also have to dive into this to prepare for the vote. I will talk about the level playing field that was already mentioned, for example, and everyone who is keen on fisheries. I have to disappoint you, I'm afraid, because I think I will leave that to the negotiators. I don't think it's as relevant for us here today as other topics, even though, of course, it has an importance. So what would I like to talk about? First of all, the general rules and institutions, a brief overview of the framework we are dealing with here. And I will also look at the scope of this deal. And then I'll take a closer look at what is called the level playing field, which was always of high political importance. Professor Scott Cato mentioned this as well as an important question in her introductory words. And of course, that leads us to the question of, well, implementing this level playing field and the sanctions regime when it is not properly implemented. Next point, social security coordination, which is very important for our citizens. And of course, that led to a very wide debate towards the end of the negotiating period. Another topic is law enforcement, judicial cooperation, and the role of human rights, of basic rights. And well, after all this, I will try to draw some preliminary conclusions. So yeah, quite a lot on my plate. But like I said, I don't want to use up all of your time, so I will have to scratch the surface only in some areas, but I'll try my best to cover all these topics. So first of all, general rules. General rules from the European Union side, we're looking at the Article 217 of the TFEU. So this is not a classic trade agreement like CETA with Canada, for example. We're rather looking at an association agreement. And the specific character of such an agreement is that it's more broad. It encloses more than just trade issues, such as the questions I just mentioned, judiciary, cooperation, judicial cooperation, social security issues, and so on. So 217 TFEU means we're looking at a horizontal agreement which goes beyond trade. And as a consequence, the European Parliament has to give its consent, and the Council has to vote unanimously in order to ratify this agreement. Ratification also needs time. And, well, if Parliament takes itself seriously, it will take this time to study this legal text, to be able to really properly vote on it. But there is a rule, a provisional application, because what everyone thought would happen did happen. We got this at very short notice, just on the 24th of December. So in case the European Parliament is not yet ready or willing to adopt or agree to this agreement, it will lead to a hard Brexit scenario. We will have a 2-month provisional application, so until 28th February 2021, as it is mentioned in the agreement. However, the Partnership Council can also delay this further. So if the Parliament needs more time and is not able to vote on it in February, then there is a possibility to extend this deadline. Well, let's see. The UK Parliament has already ratified the treaty, as Professor Scott Cato told us, and this agreement has a territorial scope, which is usually a technical issue, but here it also has political implications, because Gibraltar, for example, isn't included in this scope. There is a special rule for Gibraltar, as well as for the UK overseas territories. And that's interesting to know, because quite a lot of people were angry about this. We're talking about tax oases, about potential tax fraud, tax evasion, and everything that's mentioned in the deal does not apply to these territories or Gibraltar. So there might be an issue with that when it comes to tax fraud, etc. Now, important to know is also that we have a review clause 5 years after the entry into force of this deal. It can be completely reviewed, adapted, updated, and so on. So the idea behind this is that this was really drawn up at the last minute, maybe also with a government that not everyone was happy with. So that gives us an opportunity to look at this again in 5 years' time, to maybe adapt the agreement, and we will be able to do so every 5 years thereafter. That's quite unusual for these agreements, that type of agreement. So I think that shows us that there is a political will to work on this agreement, to come back to the negotiating table, and well, hopefully start before the end of that 5-year period, in order to come to good and sound rules. And that brings us to a general rule, because usually in EU law is directly applicable. So everyone, or the European treaty is directly applicable. So every citizen of the EU can go to court and found his or her claim on the TFEU, and that was something that people, that the Brexiteers didn't agree to, and that means that now individuals no longer have this possibility, but that the states, for example, the EU against the member states, have to find an agreement when it comes to private rights or issues. So if there is something that an individual would normally have claimed in front of a court, that issue has to be taken over by the EU and the UK. It's not possible to sort this out in front of a UK court. And another important thing, there is a general termination clause. This agreement can be terminated without stating any reasons for it, and without previous announcement, and then 12 months following notification of termination, the agreement will be terminated, will no longer be enforced. So that's a general termination clause, which is not to be found in any other piece of EU legislation or another agreement, any other agreement such as the CETA agreement or trade deal. So that's something that we should keep in mind as well. And we also have partial termination clauses in this document, that the EU or the UK can partially terminate this agreement under certain conditions. So we have a constant threat here. We can never be sure whether what we are reading today will still be enforced 12 months on. So this is quite a fragile construction here, and there's always the danger, there's always a sword of Damocles that this will be taken down, terminated due to political reasons. And well, there's been a very broad debate on Scotland as well. That's a hot topic, especially in the UK. What about Scottish independence? What if that happens, and what happens with Scotland? There is a rule in the agreement that says that the EU has to inform the United Kingdom of a new member wanting to join the European Union. However, the United Kingdom has to be notified of this, but has no veto rights. So in case Scotland becomes independent, in case Scotland becomes a member of the European Union, then the UK has to be notified, but they are not able to veto this Scottish membership of the EU. So that was just in case. So institutional framework. We have at the top of the hierarchy, so to speak, the Partnership Council, representatives of the EU and the UK. It's basically the same as the withdrawal agreement. This is co-chaired by a member of the Commission and a representative of the UK. The powers of this Partnership Council are the following. It can adopt decisions wherever the agreement provides for a legal base. It can adopt amendments to the agreement, and it can also establish specialized committees. Decisions in this Partnership Council are adopted by mutual consent, which also means that this Partnership Council, which has the right to adopt decisions, adopt amendment, and so on, will take decisions which will have consequences for companies, for citizens, and so on. So that brings us to the question of whether we have the need of a parliamentary supervision of this Partnership Council. When it's just about a trade deal, that's not usually the case. But in this case, well, that is a question that should possibly be addressed. Do we need this parliamentary supervision? Then we also have other committees, in particular the Trade Partnership Committee, TPC, and another 10 trade specialized committees. And if need be, the Partnership Council can establish further specialized committees for trade. And then we have another 8 specialized committees for other areas with certain roles in these areas. And then underneath that, we also have working groups. So a huge number of different bodies who will keep this agreement alive, put it into practice, take administrative decisions on a daily basis, or even amend this agreement. So the document that we're looking at now, well, it's a working document. It's something that is alive, so to speak. So it will change over time. And that, once again, brings me to the question of how this is maybe supervised, or how people can at least follow up on what is changing. There is definitely the idea of a parliamentary assembly. So the European Parliament and the UK Parliament can establish, or are meant to establish, this parliamentary assembly. So that means this would have the right of information, or the right of being informed by the Partnership Council, and it can also make recommendations to this council. However, this parliamentary assembly cannot adopt any binding decisions. unlike the European Parliament, whose decisions are binding. There is also a civil society forum, which more or less, well, slightly marginalized, happening on the sidelines, but can also draw up recommendations. And then the Arbitration Tribunal, that's certainly of a major importance, because this one will take action in case of contentious issues. It's established on an ad hoc basis. It's composed of 3 arbitrators, which are selected by the parties from a pre-established list. And if there is a ruling by the Arbitration Tribunal, it will be binding for the EU and the UK. These arbitration tribunals are also helped by expert panels, supported by expert panels. I'm not very keen on the German translation on this word. Expert panels is quite clumsy in German. But anyway, these will support the arbitration tribunals and replace them for the purposes of level playing field rules. But I'll come to that later on. So what do we look at here? We're looking at a trade agreement, of course. Then we're looking at law enforcement and a judicial cooperation. So that also means that there's nothing about civil law cooperation. So that's still an open question. How will civil law issues be dealt with between the UK and the EU? We do have security cooperation and we have participation in union programs.
Und hier kommt jetzt eine große Tabelle, die braucht man in seinem Detail nicht zu sehen. Weil das, wo es jetzt darauf ankommt, sind die Farben und das Farbenspiel zu erkennen.
What is necessary here are the colors and the relation between the colors. What you see first here is the single market part of the single market law of the EU treaty. The colors you see here, green. Green is what you have normally as privileges in union right. Orange means that you have less than current EU law, but more than WTO law. And red means that it's equal to WTO law, or that nothing is about the issue in WTO law. And this means that basically what we have here in red means a hard Brexit. In a certain way, what is green is a prolongation of the single market. And here you see as to the TCA, we have green and red. But also already when it comes to customs law and external duties, it becomes red. And quantitative restrictions, you have the 0 quotas in green, but then it becomes very, very red. Non-tariff trade barriers, which are not dealt in the current agreement, and this has its effects. Think of minimum standards in EU law. You have the freedoms, but we don't want to go down to the lowest standard and meet us there. No, we want to have a minimum limit through secondary law and standards. And you see that all the minimum standards have been taken out of the Brexit deal. There are special agreements on the social protection, environment, and so on, under the level playing field provisions. We have some special rules here as to discrimination and restriction prohibition. I'm going to explain what that means, but we don't have a rule on mutual recognition of professional qualifications. And this means this agreement is less than CETA, because in CETA we have a rule for mutual recognition of professional qualifications. It has been said that here this will be discussed in the future, that maybe in the future there will be an agreement on this. Financial services are not covered, freedom of establishment and so on, of the movement of capitals is not included. And this shows that only a small part of what the former EU membership meant has been copied by this agreement. interesting for the British context is what we have here, because this is the Northern Ireland protocol from the withdrawal agreement, because this continues to apply, because Northern Ireland remains a part of the single market. And you see here that exactly where in the protocol you see green, and for the Brexit agreement, you have red, you will have problems in the interior British trade or economic transports. So in the first days, many people will have the problem. I want to go from Wales to Northern Ireland, but I need to present a lot of papers. There will be checks, not as to the product standards, for agri-food and similar things. They will continue to be applied. There is no regulation on this. And the frontier is now the Irish Sea between mainland Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And this means a friction which will continue to exist and is not governed by the withdrawal agreement. Now let's have a look at the details. When talking about trade in goods, it was said zero tariff, zero quota. And in part, this is really true. This is really an achievement. But what you also have to see is that zero tariff and zero quota only apply to goods that meet the relevant rules of origin. You could say that these rules of origin stipulate the nationality of a product only if a certain type of good can be said to be clearly British. Zero tariff and zero quota apply. And if you have a product which consists of many components, sourced from different countries, like cars, you have a problem. If a car contains of over 45% of materials coming neither from the UK or the EU, zero tariff and zero quota do not apply. Similar, but with a later entry into force, namely on December 31st, 2026, applies to electric cars for which batteries do not come from the UK or the EU. Or another example, cane sugar from the Caribbean, but refined in the UK, will not qualify for zero tariff, zero quota, cannot be traded without the tariff. Or meat products, for example, according to the agreement, meat products can only have a zero tariff and zero quota rule if the animal in question was born and raised in the UK or the EU. And this shows already that these rules of origin are kind of undermining the effect of zero tariff, zero quota. What is very relevant is that in this part, we don't have an exemption of non-tariff trade barriers in the form of product standards. This is true for phytosanitary and sanitary measures. And for such product standards, a conformity assessment is necessary, i.e. the question has to be put, does a British product conform to European rules? In CETA, there is a mutual recognition for such assessments, which means that a Canadian authority could check whether a Canadian product complies with EU rules and could certify this. This we don't have in Brexit anymore. So we have a double check system. First, when the product leaves the country, the region, and then when it enters into the European Union. And as to SPS measures, whether they have been complied with, well, this has to be checked on both sides. Not for every product, one has to say, but for individual products, they can be taken randomly and then they apply for the whole batch. But such checks will have to be carried out, and this means also costs. Now let's talk about services. Services for services, we have the principle of non-discrimination and market access. But then we have a negativist approach. In the annexes, hundreds of pages at the end of the legal text in which the member states said all the measures we list in these annexes can restrict British products, even if they don't limit EU products. And this means that there is a patchwork for British companies because things are possible for them in Italy, which are not possible in Cyprus, for example, can be exported to Italy, but not to Cyprus. And then another important question, a service can enter the single market if it complies with the provision of non-discrimination within each member state, but services are often personal services, i.e. They come together with a person who is the service provider, but you don't want to have many persons crossing the channel, and therefore the freedom of movement connected to service provision has been limited clearly. Short-time business visitors who want to go to the United States don't have to present a visa, but only if they're part of the following list. And you see, this is quite a short list: meetings and consultations, research and design, commercial transactions, trading seminars, purchasing activities, and translation and interpretation, as a matter of fact, or tourism. But you see, these are relatively limited fields. And then the Guardian could read that a model living in Britain cannot go to Milan for a photo session anymore because this person would need a visa, i.e. the person could still go to Italy, but it will be much more difficult for her in the future. And this is the tendency of the whole thing. The freedom of movement for persons has to be restricted. This becomes clear here. And the service part is a very thin part of the treaty. The title is very pompous, but then you don't have much. And this means that the freedom of services is very, very thin, I would say. We have something, we have a bit more than nothing, but not a whole lot. And this shows when you have a look at financial services. Here you have a basic regulation according to which market access on the basis of non-discrimination, provided that service providers are established in the respective countries. But financial services in the member states can only be provided according to the rules there for such services, i.e. you don't have an access to the entire single market, i.e. to all the 27 member states. For this, you need an equivalence decision, as it is called. And the European Commission says on this topic that in a third country, the legal order and the supervision has to be comparable to European rules and has to be so comparable that such openings are possible. Such a decision can always be taken back without mentioning reasons if you mean that the legal orders have been developing away from one another. And this is something which is discussed politically at the moment. In the past, the Commission often said that they wanted such an equivalence decision before December 31st, 2020. Well, this has not happened for political reasons. And I think the politicians here can maybe say something on them. An equivalence decision, a very important instrument in hands of the European Union unilaterally. It can be used. So this is quite some important. But on the other hand, you want to achieve something if you give this concession. And what in the negotiations was presented, we have to say was not sufficient for the negotiators to be ready for such a decision before December the 31st, 2020. We just have a memorandum of understanding saying that such equivalence decisions will be taken. And this is different from other commitments, for example, towards Japan. Now I'd like to talk about the level playing field. What is meant by the level playing field? The level playing field means that all standards are checked, which are not connected directly to the product, but have an influence on the price of a product on the global market. For example, state aids, which are given to a company, mean that the company can lower its prices and then be in a better competitive position towards other companies once it has entered the single market. This is something you don't want. So in the Brexit deal, we have mentioned 6 topics in this respect, 6 areas. You have competition law, i.e. monopolies and the abuse of dominant positions. Then you have state aid, taxation questions, labor and social standards, environmental and climate standards, and trade and sustainable development questions, among others, multilateral instruments in this respect. Let's have a look now at how the level playing field has been implemented. How can you put something like this into force? The whole idea was that until a few days ago, the UK was part of the union law. We shared a common legal space. But now we have a problem because work and social security questions, we will have deviations from EU law, and the question is, what can you do then? And you have to ask yourself, is it stipulated that there are no deviations? Is there a non-regression clause somewhere which prohibits this? And the EU or the UK, if they realize that one of the partners has made regressive steps, what can the other party do? Do they have remedies? As to the level playing field, you have to look back. We have one standard at a point in time X, and the question is, from that point in time on, have there been changes? Have there been divergences? But the EU could also say, well, we'd like to have more. We want to strengthen our rules. And this would mean that the legal orders drift apart from one another without one of the partners having done anything. And the question is, what can be done in such a case? So if we have now a look at the different political areas, you see that in the field of competition law, the only possibility there is that when there is anti-competitive behavior of companies, you have to take this up in national law and get enforcement there. As to state aids, you have a little bit more. You have domestic enforcement, but the European Union can also apply unilateral remedial measures and can also do something when there is this divergence I mentioned. As to taxes, things look quite differently. As to taxes, there is no possibility to do something in the UK when there is tax competition, and the EU cannot do anything either because there are no measures with which they can do something against the diversion in this respect. Only some OECD rules have been mentioned in the contract, but here too, there are no enforcement measures mentioned if the UK or the EU decide to act otherwise. Labor and social standards are a different thing. You have domestic enforcement. There is a non-regression prohibition, and if there is a regression, you have remedies, and there is also protection against divergence. And the same you have in the field of environment and climate. When it comes to trade and sustainable development, things are different because we have nothing, no domestic enforcement, no non-regression clause, and what is mentioned here in this chapter cannot be subject to sanctions by the EU. Talking about sanctions, what does the sanctions regime look like? We have seen that there are certain possibilities, but how effective are they? Professor Scott Cato asked this question at the beginning. Basically, we have the WTO trade measures, anti-dumping measures, countervailing duties, and safeguards. These are classical global trade instruments, which have to be seen also in the slide, in the light of trade law. If you don't comply with the labor law, this is not necessarily covered here. What is interesting here are the temporary remedies which are possible for the EU, i.e. compensation or the suspension of parts of the agreement. And this means that also duties could be asked for, could be requested, which means that a party of the treaty, after a decision of an arbitration court, could decide that they do not implement such a ruling, because an arbitration court has to be requested at first, and this is only possible for certain treaty duty obligations. A lot of them are excluded, which I'm not going to mention in detail. As to the existing protection levels for labor and social protection and environmental and climate protection, do we have a weakening here or a reduction of these protections? And legally seen, this is interesting because in the German text, it is said that when it has a meaning affecting trade or investment, then consultations are possible, can be initiated. If they are not successful, you will have a panel report, and this means that the EU can then apply measures. So there is the joint protection level, but additionally, to the divergence, you have to prove that it affects trade and investment. As to the aids, the procedures are different here. Tariffs are possible, or there can be a suspension of treaty rights or concessions. And if an aid has been given, which substantially has negative effect on trade and investment, or causes a serious risk to cause such negative effects. And here, the European Union has to decide whether they want to go this way. If they do, they have to inform the UK. And if within 60 days nothing happens, then the EU can unilaterally apply measures. The only thing the EU has to do within these 60 days is that they have to enter conversations with the UK. They have to be terminated, they have to lead to anything, but discussions or consultations have to have taken place. And then after 60 days, the EU can unilaterally apply measures, and the UK can then attack them before an arbitration court. But there is no other mechanism which has to be applied before the EU could become active towards the UK, or the other way around. What about the future now? If in the future there are significant effects because of significant divergences, then you can initiate the rebalancing or compensation measures, as they could be also called, means that there can be tariffs imposed or concessions suspended. The way to do this is shown here. Prior consultations have to be held on the essential differences. If these consultations fail, then you can impose a compensating tariff. But there's also the possibility that the other party goes before the arbitration panel and has the arbitration panel check whether what the other party has done was righteous or not. But what is necessary to go for going this way is that you show that there have been essential divergences which have had an effect on trade and investment. So the major restriction is that all the differences which we see in terms of level playing field have to have an effect on trade or investment. And this means the following. Here, a question which will be very important to us in the future is whether this whole system, this whole regime we have here brings something or not. We have an example here, an arbitration case, USA against Guatemala under the CAFTA-DR, i.e. between the US and the states of Central America. In this case, Guatemala had not complied with labor law and labor rights provisions. But the final question here was that certain labor law standards had not been introduced at all in Guatemala. So it was very easy to prove that these labor law provisions had not been complied with. But in this Central American Free Trade Agreement, you have the following phrase: in a manner affecting trade between the parties. So the labor law infringements have to affect trade between the parties. This is an important precondition, and that was the legal question before the panel. What happened when Guatemala did not comply with labor law provisions? Did this really affect the trade between the parties? And this was the point at which the United States failed. The request was rejected because what Guatemala had done had not affected the trade between the parties. The US failed to prove that there were cost savings from specific labor rights violations and that the savings were of sufficient scale to confer a material competitive advantage in trade between the parties. The US would have had to prove that this lowering of labor standards was cost relevant, was so cost relevant that it had not only cost advantages for individual companies, but in general in trade, that it was so relevant that there was a competitive advantage due to these labor law violations for Guatemala. And this means that there is a very high standard of proof the US could not satisfy. So the only proceeding this is the only proceeding so far which has dealt with such a question. And this means that you could conclude that the whole thing does not really bite. However, in the case of an arbitration between the EU and the UK, things can be decided very differently than what happened between the US and Guatemala, because there is no stare decisis in the different panels. There's no binding connection between the different panels. Each panel decides on its legal base. And you also have to say that the economic relationship between the EU and the UK are quite different from what they are between the US and Guatemala. The differences are much smaller, so minor deviations or divergences could already mean that the conditions are met. If a panel later agrees with such a view of things, will have to be seen. But we also have to see that the reason why we have this trade relevance in this text was that the scope of LPF provisions was to be reduced, was to be restricted, which meant that you had to ask for proof for more than a mere deviation from certain labor right provisions, etc. So it will be very difficult to predict what will happen here. And I think for those who participate in the ratification proceedings, it is important to see this, to have an opinion on this. In the US, you have the new NAFTA agreement with Canada and Mexico, and they have the problem there that in the LPF clause, they have conversion of the burden of proof. They have repeated what we have seen here, but they said that it is supposed that when there is divergence, it is trade relevant. And if this is not the case, it has to be proven. This is a procedural trick, but kind of strengthens such a clause a little bit. And this could be a way for the parliament. They could say, the way we understood this trade relevance, the burden of proof has to be turned around. But on the other hand, you have to see that this border is a very important one, which will decide how effective the level playing field provisions will be in the future. And now I would like to leave this area and would briefly talk about the following areas which are of relevance. Let's talk about the social security first. And here we have something which was a positive surprise. The protocol on the coordination of social security replicates basically the existing EU legal order. Large chunks of this have been taken over, and this means that here we go much further than many expected this. In the protocol, you also have a non-discrimination rule, and we have something which is relevant in the British context, i.e. access to sickness benefits and to healthcare outside the UK, i.e. even if you're a citizen of the UK, in the UK you will not have the EHIC anymore, but the protocol creates an arrangement which is comparable to this rule as to its contents and effect. The differences are in the detail here. On the one hand, they refer to posted workers. The posting of workers, well, here you have the basic rule up to 24 months. If you have a worker employed in Germany who is posted to the Netherlands for 24 months, then according to German law, German contributions to Social Security have to be paid. So you don't have to pay into Dutch Social Security funds. But this will change, i.e. the posted worker will continue to pay into the British fund, but the workers have the right to an opt-in into the former rule. They have to declare, the employers have this opt-in. They can say whether they want to pay, to continue to pay in the UK or in the other country. So far, there are 3 categories mentioned by the protocol, and we'll have to wait and see what the member states decide. And at the European level, here, you could imagine that Germany is not so much interested in this than maybe countries like Bulgaria or Romania. What is also not covered are family benefits and certain benefits for people who need care. And then finally, unemployed benefits cannot be exported if you look for a job in an EU member state. But that is understandable, because if you continue freedom of movement, you also have to discontinue the freedom of movement of unemployed. But these are fringe areas. As to the core, the protocol has taken over one-to-one what EU law stipulated. And I think this has to be a very positive surprise.
Hier haben wir Regelungen vorgesehen, dass
law enforcement, there are rules which make sure that the exchange of PNR data can be continued, but the European Union can terminate this unilaterally if they are of the opinion that
abused by the
UK is not using these data properly.
Then you have certain possibilities. You can suspend these rights. The same is true for sharing DNA, fingerprint, and vehicle registration data if the EU means that there is too much of a divergence of legislation. And you also have to see that so far that as to the PRIM database, only a match-no-match query is possible, no direct real-time access to the database. This will in the future not be possible, this direct access to EU databases. And this also has an effect on the Schengen information system. Here you don't have either, but you have information exchange, and according to the same logic, there is cooperation with Europol and Eurojust, i.e. you cooperate with one another, but you have much less than what you had during membership. And in this whole context, the data protection is very relevant. And in this respect, I'd like to mention briefly that the agreement foresees that within a provisional period of 4 months can be lengthened to 6 months. European data protection laws apply to the UK. And this means that it is certain that data will be exchanged under the provisions of the EU. The EU needs an equivalence decision, and once this decision has been set up, then the next step will follow. But for the time being, data protection rules from the EU will continue to apply. There are also extradition rules in this agreement, which follow largely the logic of the European arrest warrant, with a few exceptions. For example, the member states and the UK can use an opt-out, according to which they don't extradite own nationals to the other party. But on the other hand, there is a list of 32 offenses for which dual criminality tests are not necessary, i.e. for which you don't have to prove that the same criminality does not exist in the extraditing state. So this is the basic idea for the European arrest warrant, which has been taken over into the Brexit deal.
Menschenrechten. Das ist insoweit noch
Now, let me look at human rights. This is also a remarkable debate because well, it's also a hot topic in the UK. We are once again looking at an essential elements clause. So that means that protection of human rights, if it is violated in a severe and a material way, the agreement in its entirety can be terminated. So these essential substantial elements are, for example, democracy, rule of law, and also climate change. Fight against climate change. For example, if the UK leaves the Paris Agreement, the European Union would be able to unilaterally terminate the agreement with the UK. And it wouldn't have to observe the 12-month deadline. And another essential element would be the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. In terms of criminal law, this agreement says that if the European, if the United Kingdom leaves the ECHR, it's also a possibility to terminate Part 3 or suspend Part 3 without further conditions. The suspension of Part 3 can happen if there are serious and systemic deficiencies as regards the protection of fundamental rights, principle of the rule of law, or the protection of personal data. So once again, if human rights standards are lowered, the European Union can take action. I would now like to come to my preliminary conclusions. However, there's one last point that I would like to mention. There's one aspect that I didn't mention, the participation of the UK in union programs, which is very, very technical, but also highly political, because the European Union and the UK agreed that they would stay together when it comes to Horizon. The UK will still take part in that, and in research cooperation as well. And also, however, on the other side, the UK has decided to leave the Erasmus program and has started its own program, which in my view is insufficient. The EU did offer the UK to stay in the EU programs. So generally speaking, if they were to be willing to do so, there has to be a cooperation agreement, and the UK would have to pay its contribution into the EU budget to be able to participate, and they also have to commit to this payment for the programming period of 7 years. Only under these conditions can a third country be part of a union program, and that's the case for Horizon, but for example, it isn't for Erasmus+, and that's of course very regrettable. Now, bird's eye view, what does this mean? It's a very political deal, but it's not a very ambitious deal. It mainly looks at tariff issues, at customs issues, and the trade aspects. So we're basically looking at the red lines that both negotiation partners drew. Great Britain wanted to leave the internal market and wanted to end the freedom of movement, and the EU wanted to protect the internal market and certain rules, and that has happened. We have a trade deal that is unprecedented. So both parties have been able to implement their red lines. However, they've missed the opportunity to create something future-oriented, future-proof, that creates a new path for, well, the future. However, the protocol for social security and the special rules on climate change, I think that's an important topic, and the success, the fact that this was included here. However, there will be big problems coming up when it comes to the role of Northern Ireland. However, I think that's even going to be more difficult for the UK than for the EU. And also, another question, there are a lot of unilateral options or possibilities to terminate the agreement, to come up with sanctions or with balancing measures, and I wonder what the role of the Parliament will be here, the European Parliament and potentially also the national parliaments. Are they to play a role? How can we make sure that there's also a democratic process linked to all of this, a supervisory process? So my overall conclusion, preliminary conclusion, would be that we have a very long piece of document, which is, however, well, missing major aspects, does include some interesting aspects when it comes to trade law. So I do think this is not the end of the story. We have to continue working on it so that the parts where we do have a hard Brexit will come to a solution in the coming months and years in the best interest of both parties, of both sides. So that's it from my side for the moment. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope this wasn't too confusing. This wasn't too much legalese for you. I hope I was able to provide you with a bit of insight into this situation, the Brexit deal, and well, now I'm looking forward to your question and to the debate. So I'd like to pass the floor back to Sven and Anna. Thank you very much, René. I hope this is working. Hope you can all hear me. Yes, great. Thank you so much. I did read the text during the Christmas period, and still, it was only now that I understood a certain number of points, because this is just a massive piece of paper that we had to go through, and it is very, very technical. So thank you very much for these insights. Now, I would like to react on a few points that you mentioned, and maybe give my political opinion on them, and then I would like to address some of the questions that were asked in the Q&A. And then later on, we'll obviously pass the floor to Sven as well, because he would like to address the topic of the financial markets. So this is really fascinating topic, because we are also in a situation where we have to decide, we as the European Parliament, how we are dealing with this. It was a very unfortunate situation. We got the text on the 24th of December. Originally, the deadline was the 31st of October. So now we have a provisional application of this text, and that's something we never wanted, because you just create facts, which later on will be very hard to reverse. So from a political point of view, I would really like to state that this is a big exception for us, and I hope this will not create a precedent for future negotiations. And something else is, yeah, what you mentioned as well, the parliamentary supervision, parliamentary control. When we look at trade deals in the past, CETA was one example that you quoted. We always had regulatory cooperation, we had committees and so on, but now as a parliament, we don't have any options really. There's no transparency, we don't even know what's happening. No control, no supervision whatsoever. And yeah, we do have a partnership council that can even amend the agreement, can amend the annexes, can set up new committees, but we're not in any way part of this as the European Parliament. Well, I think that makes things very difficult for us. And that is something we have to focus on, because as the European Parliament, we are not able to amend the text anymore. Unfortunately, that's also a big issue. But yeah, we have to concentrate on making sure that our rights are enforced as well, that our role is being met. That's a very central point, I think. And a second point, from the point of view of my committee, so to speak, the Internal Market Committee, is the fact that the integrity of the internal market is intact, and that was a negotiating goal of the European Union. That was also something that the European Parliament underlined in its resolution. So that was achieved, and it's interesting that there are many elements which we've asked for in many other trade negotiations. So some progress has been made, but the question is, how effective will this progress be implemented? How effective will these rules be in practice? So as the European Parliament, we should really demand very clear and stringent definitions of divergence. What does it mean? And how do we deal with divergence remedies? How do we deal with the concept of a level playing field? Because we cannot find anything on that in the document. So who does decide in the end whether we're dealing with a case of divergence or regression and so on? And I think as the European Parliament, we should be able to have that power. So in our resolution, we also asked for that kind of alignment, but that's not included now. But in the future, we have the possibility to create such a situation, such an alignment. Last point, and then we'll come to your questions, which are also very important. Progress has been made. and the relation to the United Kingdom is a very special one. We are coming from a joint single market, and still, I think this is also important for better trade deals in the future. The Commission always mentioned this Guatemala case to me, which you also mentioned, and always says, well, we cannot ask social security for social security standards and so on. And suddenly we find them here. Climate change is also an element here. And I think that's something we should use in the future for future deals. So now I hope that all of you voted on the questions, because I will ask the questions that got the most likes first, because they seem to be the most important ones. Frederik Hausmann's question first.
With the so-called backstop in Ireland. The media lately didn't talk about it. Du hast Irland schon erwähnt. Ich würde jetzt die Frage erst...
You briefly mentioned Ireland, so I'd like to pass that question to you, René, just to have a starting point. Okay, so question on Ireland, and maybe further on in the process I can address what you said. Well, if you have something that cannot be held back, then, well, go ahead. Let's do a bit of back and forth, and then we'll see how we go, I would suggest. Because you also brought up some issues, and they are more general in issues, questions of principle. So now, the backstop. The famous backstop. The protocol on the withdrawal agreement has also entered into force on 1st of January 2021, which means that Northern Ireland will stay part of the customs union, of the internal market, single market, and will also take part in the external tariff regime of the EU, SPS measures, TPD, and so on, product standards, etc., etc. Environmental rules of the European law will still be applicable in Northern Ireland, and the European Commission and the European Court of Justice will still be active and in Northern Ireland, and their decisions will still be binding. So this backstop remains in force until there is a broad trade deal which addresses all the questions that are now addressed in the protocol. And this current trade deal does not address all those questions, and that's why the protocol stays in force, and no one is questioning that. Another case might be that until December 2025, the Regional Parliament of Northern Ireland has to give its democratic consent, which means there has to be a majority decision on accepting and further applying the protocol. And if they do it with cross-community support, this will stay in force for another 4 or 8 years. So every 4 or 8 years, this will have to be voted on until there is an overarching trade deal between the UK and the European Union, which addresses all the Northern Ireland related issues. That means that the trade deal and the protocol are now in force in a parallel way, and that leads to problems. For example, the boss of Marks and Spencer complained to the British government that due to rules of origin, they have problems in trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Well, that was pretty obvious that this was going to happen, and Johnson did exactly what Theresa May said British Prime Minister could never do, to draw a line, to draw a border within the UK, and that's exactly what he did. It's actually quite astonishing that we don't hear a lot about that in the media. We hear a little bit more in the UK because you can see the consequences also in the ports of Wales. However, we don't hear a lot about it in the rest of Europe, which I find quite surprising. However, Ireland has also become active. Ireland has extended Erasmus Plus to Northern Ireland so that students can still take part in that program. So those are some points where the protocol has concrete, tangible results. And well, How about environmental rights is another issue, and how can that be aligned with the LPF rules in the overall trade deal? But that's all very complicated. So the protocol is in force as well as the trade deal and as well as the agreement. And I think that will lead to some problems in the future. Thank you very much. So I would now like to take up the question of Thilo Meyer. The Brits were supposed to pay 35 or 39 billion euro for the separation according to the agreement. So what's going on with that? Yes, that was part of the withdrawal agreement. It's a legal obligation, could be enforced by the European Court of Justice if need be. I'm not sure whether actually any payments have been made, actually, but I'm pretty sure that the Commission will follow up on that and will apply to the European Court of Justice if necessary. Some legal procedures have already been almost started in case of infringement. So I think these payments will have been made or will be made because they definitely are to be made according to the agreement. They are not part of the current deal. There will only be payment rules in those cases where the UK remains a part of union programs. Thank you. So next question comes from Serena Stellard.
The deal mean for EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU? Das ist eine weite Frage, aber vielleicht kannst du ein paar Stichpunkte nennen.
A very broad question, but maybe a few points on that. I think, well, when we look at the withdrawal agreement, that tells us basically about everything that happened in the past. Everyone who obtains his or her settling status now will be dealt with as a British citizen, and otherwise European citizens will be treated as such in the on the British side. So now basically the national law in the UK or in EU member states is applicable. So you can't really use any thing from the past for the present. You can use your rights, of course, and you do not lose them. They kind of have been frozen, so you will not lose those. But from now on, things are different. Things are treated according to national law. We also have a protocol that I mentioned, a protocol of social security claims, and that's really quite astounding because the UK was very reticent to adopt something like this. So the European system of social security coordination will be continued. So anyone who moves to the UK now doesn't have to be scared about double payments, about losing his or her social security rights, because there will be a continuity of the coordination system. But that's pretty much the end of it. Anything that goes beyond that will be dealt with according to national law, and EU citizens, for example, will be treated as third country nationals in the UK and vice versa. Very interesting. So once again, I've learned something, which is that national law will be applicable. So from one member state to the next, things will be different. So now a provocative question: will we have new?
weil das stark in die Richtung geht, wie die Steuerregeln aussehen.
Dann heben wir die für Sven auf, der ist jetzt gleich dran. Ich würde noch eine Frage nehmen und dann an Sven übergeben. Von J.G. Smith. The current discussion in the UK is self-centered. Both sides, Leavers and Remainers, are talking only about what UK wants, might do, will ask for. From the EU perspective, how do you see EU relationship with UK developing, and what the UK needs to do so to be able even to talk about rejoining?
Jetzt komme ich in den Graubereich zwischen wissenschaftlicher Redlichkeit und politischer
Well,
Meinungsäußerung.
now we're in the twilight zone of well, having a certain scientific responsibility, but on the other hand, it's political as well. If the debate will continue in a way that it is taking place now, then I think it will be difficult to rejoin the EU at some point. We have to see a different sort of debating culture in the UK. I don't think that under Boris Johnson, the UK will even think about rejoining the EU. However, the UK is not a third world country, and it does have a functioning democracy. We will see other governments, other parties, party leaders being in powers. There are also lobbyists. There are trade unions. We have a civil society that exists in the UK and which makes its voice heard. So I do think from a realpolitik point of view, the UK is simply not able to move away from the EU as much as some members of the House of Commons dream of. So I think, well, at some point we will be forced to come together again. And that also means that we cannot move as far away from each other as some might think. Some people might then say, well, actually, it wasn't so bad to be a part of the EU. The single market does have its opportunities, its advantages, but to have these thoughts and to actually utter them requires this change in political culture. Yes, that's definitely a difficult question. Maybe we can hear Molly on that later on as well. But I would like to hear Sven now on the topic of financial issues. So Sven, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Anna. First of all, chapeau, René. That was brilliant, very clear. I think, just great. I'm really amazed how you did this, how you managed to tell us what this is all about, and people stuck with us as well. We listened to a lawyer, to a legal expert for 1 hour, so that's really a huge achievement. And I think this is really amazing. And I think we also have an amazing audience. We have a Baroness Bennett also who is listening to us from the House of Lords. So I think if we even have baronesses here listening to us, that's something we cannot even offer in Germany. Maybe you will be part of the House of Lords too, Molly. Lord Molly, that would be a hit. So on a more serious note, Molly said it's important not to totally lose your sense of humor. But yeah, financial services are also part of this trade deal, and there's no automatic opening of the markets, as you explained, René. That will be done bit by bit. On the other hand, Great Britain is a very important place for financial services, and Molly and I have always been concerned by the fact that Great Britain is kind of a black hole for dirty money already now. So what will the UK do? Will the UK become the next Switzerland for black money, for dirty money? Well, actually, that's not something that will happen in the future. That has happened already. It is already the case, and it is already the case in Germany as well, we have to admit, because for money laundering, Germany is a paradise in Europe. When it comes to tax, I think Great Britain or the UK itself is not an oasis, is not a tax haven, but it has its kind of network of other jurisdictions, and there we do have tax havens. I think about 1/3 of the global damage caused by tax havens is caused by or in the British offshore territories. Now, when we look at this agreement, the Brexit deal, it is very unfortunate that there is no obligation to keep on evolving jointly. We have the existing money laundering law, we have existing tax laws that are taken over, but well, the point is that Europe, for example, said that it will make changes in terms of money laundering legislation. It will enforce a stricter supervision. It will enforce a stricter tax and money laundering legislation. And we have a draft for this legislation, which means, yeah, there will be progress. However, that progress will no longer be made because on the part of the UK, because the trade deal is the status quo and will remain the status quo in the future. And that's why we also wrote a letter, myself together with a few colleagues, to say that adjustments have been made, because otherwise equivalent decisions cannot be made. So financial service providers from the city can only have access to the European marketplace to make sure, if they make sure that they don't do what Farage or others have announced, Brexit bad boys, as Molly called them, for example, to say, well, we'll decrease the corporate tax and create tax competition. So I'll make this letter available to you, and I think it is important for the European Parliament to discuss how we will deal with the City of London. Is it enough for us that a small company is being founded in the EU as a placeholder, so to speak, and the decisions will still be taken in the City of London? Or do we have to make sure that the EU has its own financial marketplaces? And do we have to make sure, when it comes to the capital markets union and banking unions, that we take the steps that are needed for the EU? Those are the current questions, but especially important to us is that we continue to work on the rules for money laundering, for tax evasion. But as it stands, the agreement will no longer deal with further development of that legislation. But now let me come back to your questions. What are the possible implications for Scotland and Northern Ireland is one question here. Is there an opportunity for a further referendum in Scotland? Is anything mentioned in the deal on that? No, nothing. This agreement just says what will happen if another country wants to join the EU. The UK wants to be notified, of course, but like I said, they don't have a right to veto any new memberships. Whether Scotland or Northern Ireland will become independent of the United Kingdom, that's the question where the union law doesn't have a say, or it doesn't comment on it. Maybe Professor Scott Cato can tell us a bit more about the current debate, but I think there are clear demands for a second Scottish referendum, independence referendum, but Westminster will probably not allow it. And as far as I know, Westminster would have to allow it if such a referendum were to take place again. In Northern Ireland, the situation is different. In the Good Friday Agreement, it says that a reunification referendum between Northern Ireland and Ireland is possible if there is a majority for such a reunification in Northern Ireland. And until now, that has never been the case. There has never been such a majority. There was always a majority for staying in the UK. If that changes, should that change, then the Parliament of Northern Ireland can contact Westminster, can submit that to the Parliament in Westminster, and then a referendum would be possible, and also as a consequence reunification with Ireland. But then we wouldn't have the case of a new member state. It would basically be the same case as when the reunification of Germany happened. So both parts of Germany then were automatically part of the European Union, and in that case both parts of Ireland would become or still be part of the European Union, members of the European Union. But this is all something that might potentially happen in the future. I don't have a crystal ball. No one knows. In any case, we can say that union law does not apply here. And if a new member state will join the European Union, there are no barriers to that. Yes, that was very clear. Thank you very much. And next question. Axel Kurt is asking us, how about the fact that the UK is exiting the Erasmus Plus program? What negative consequences does this have for students? Well, this is of course dramatic. It's a drastic decision. Of course, I'm not very familiar with the details of this program in the UK, which was now drawn up as, well, a parallel program as an alternative, so to speak. Maybe Professor Scott Cato can tell us a bit more, but I think it is far below that the things that Erasmus Plus offers. Erasmus Plus is very attractive for students, and also to come to the UK was very attractive via the Erasmus Plus program, because people speak English, quite simply. Well, now you can come to the Netherlands as a student. You can have your exchange there. The weather is beautiful, just as it is in Brussels. The qualities of studies are similar, so there are some options. But of course, this is a political question, because every student within the Erasmus program kind of lived through a European experience. Everyone, all the Erasmus students are, well, Europeans forever, Europeans in their heart, and they often came back to their country to and wanted to create change the culture, change the way of thinking when it comes to the EU. And I think, yeah, it goes far beyond technical aspects, and I'm not sure that this can be ensured with the British alternative, and we will unfortunately have a lot less of exchange. Also, yeah, exchange between schools used to be possible, and that was also an opportunity to promote help for disadvantaged children. So those might be regrettable consequences as well. But yeah, like I said, I'm not familiar with the program on the UK side, which will apply now. But I think from a political point of view, this is a clear negative signal. Very dramatic, I have to say.
Next question by Piotr Kaczynski. What are the lessons from Brexit for the future of the UK, for the EU, not the UK, in particular for countries which are outside of the Eurozone, especially Sweden, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic?
Das ist jetzt auch das sind auch eine große Anzahl von Staaten zusammengeworfen, die äußerst unterschiedlich sind.
Well, many states have now mentioned which are quite different. Let me say the following. The way I see it, the consequences that have to be drawn from the whole Brexit affair is the EU is not without guilt in this whole thing. I am among the Brexit researchers which believe that the activity in Great Britain was the main reason for the positive referendum before the Brexit. But I think that waiting lists for NHS activities in certain regions were also reasons, and rising inequalities produced dissatisfaction with the EU. So national reasons were important in my view, but the European Union also played a role. We've mentioned a few issues. The question of redistribution among member states is an important issue. And here you can look toward the east, toward Eastern European member states, and the cohesion funds don't have enough money in order to really lead to a redistribution of funds in Europe. But then there are other problems the funds have, which stand in the way of them really contributing to such a redistribution or rebalancing. So the European Union has maybe homeworks to carry out in order to prevent for future Brexits, i.e. combat inequalities. That is an important permanent topic on the European agenda. And this is important so that people don't believe that the European Union is only an economic union for companies. The EU can do things, but first and foremost, this is the responsibility of the member states themselves. They have to do their homeworks so that dissatisfaction among the people do not lead to a country wanting to leave the EU, because this normally doesn't lead to situations which are better than the current one in the EU. Well, I'm always happy when we hear from a British perspective, Molly. So Molly, if you want to take the floor, I mean, you will take over the conclusions anyway, but if you want to answer a few of the questions we've heard now, I'd give you the floor now.
Thank you very much, Sven. And let me say, as you said, Sven, a big thank you to René. That was incredibly useful, and I hope we'll all get the slides afterwards. I hope I will anyway, because I'll certainly be wanting to share them with people here. And it's very nice to be on a call with Germans where you constantly refer to me as professor. It's a shame Robert Rowland hasn't attended any of these events, so he knows that I'm a professor. Anyway, joking aside, I just wanted to cover a couple of political points, because obviously I'm not going to tangle with René over any of the legal points. But I'll talk a little bit about Northern Ireland and Scotland and about our possible rejoining. And first of all, about Erasmus, which was, I think, really symbolic of the way Brexit's worked, because for sort of political demonstration reasons, we've completely shot ourselves in the foot. This idea that it was costing us money for students to come and study, which was the excuse the Prime Minister gave, was completely absurd. The benefits that we were gaining through young people coming and studying and loving our country and getting to know us and then wanting to come and work with us, and all of those benefits, as indeed many people on this call, I'm sure, visited the UK and studied in the UK, gained us so much more. And there was absolutely no problem with continuing with that, but it was a sort of tragic and spiteful decision, which symbolises the tragic and spiteful decision of Brexit as a whole, in my view. The thing about rejoining is we can't rejoin until we've learned the pain of Brexit. And obviously, I think that's going to be a very significant pain in many different ways, which is why I tried to stop it. But we haven't stopped it. And that's because people believed lies rather than truths, in my view. And people are now going to have to learn the truths. So I worked a lot, as Sven knows, on VAT. This was what I did as my sort of penance for the Green Group. And it's a hugely complicated area. And suddenly everybody's woken up in the UK and realised how complicated it is when you're outside the EU system and how expensive it is to import and export things. And it's just one small example of things we were arguing that people said was nonsense. People are learning that now. They're learning that they'll have their cheese sandwiches confiscated and they have to have their pets vaccinated for rabies 3 months before, and 1,000 other things which they were told wouldn't be true. So it's going to be an unpleasant period of loss and learning for us for a while. And of course, we're also going to have to restore our democracy. It's very kind of you to say we're not a third world country. That's just a question of time, in my view. And it's very kind of you to say we're a democracy, which is also quite debatable in my view. But, you know, until we are a proper democracy and can have a democratic debate, we won't be voting to rejoin anyway, and we wouldn't be let in anyway. So, you know, there's a lot of work we have to do first, I think. I'm being harsh on my own country, but I think only rightly so. And the most important thing we need to do is to review our own history and stop seeing ourselves as some kind of huge power on the world stage and this nostalgia for empire. And all of that, if we go through that as a country, will be good, because it's long overdue. All my life, we should have done that learning and atonement as well. And we failed. And that's why Brexit happened. So there's a lot of work for us to do. On a more technical economic point, we'll have to also get our heads around the idea of giving up the pound, I think, which is quite a big thing for me. I mean, if we ever apply to rejoin, I hope the EU is going to say you have to take the euro. And you know, for a country that hasn't gone bankrupt and has defended the pound since 1380, I think it is, that is a big deal. But anyway, that has to be imposed on us, because that will force us to become real Europeans. Until we're ready for that, you should say no. And we have to do the work at home, in my view. Quickly on Scotland, when you live outside the UK, I think these things can look quite technical and legal, but obviously when you're a part of this country, they're cultural and emotional. And those can be very powerful forces and quite dangerous forces, I think, potentially. In the case of Scotland, the Tories always opposed devolution. And so I agree with René that they will refuse the referendum. But the point is there will be elections this May, and the Scottish National Party, who support independence, obviously, and the Green Party, who also support independence, will get an overwhelming majority of seats. And so there is a kind of de facto sense of justice around the need for Scotland to become independent. And that is going to become a nasty constitutional crisis next year, or rather, sorry, this year, later this year. And Northern Ireland is even more painful. I mean, for anybody of my age who lived through the Troubles, which was effectively a civil war, it's, you know, it was very impressive the way the EU defended the need to protect the peace process. But it's just not a small thing to say there'll be a vote on the unification of Ireland, and actually the creation of that border in the Irish Sea and the de facto pressure to unify Ireland itself creates political tensions that I think are potentially quite dangerous. So I think these are two big tensions that have been put into the situation as a result of the Brexit vote.
Thank you. I have a number of additional questions, which I would forward to René, and then in the end, Molly and Anna will conclude the webinar. But first, Kira Tail, yeah, no one knows. What challenges lie ahead for environmental protection and policy? Although there's a non-regression in the deal, does Brexit pose any threats to the environment?
Any what? Any?
Threats.
Threats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, threats. Brexit itself is a threat for the environment insofar as Great Britain could fall under the environmental standards of the EU. But the other way around, it is also possible. The EU could lower their standards and be below the standards in the UK, or could not increase their standards when they're increased in the UK. So this goes both ways. And this depends very much on the debate that will be held in the UK and in the EU on the issue of environmental protection. So Brexit, yes, can become a problem in this regard. because there are new possibilities for UK. They can lower their standards, or European environmental law is standard law, and the British law is procedural law, which means that in environmental law there are many groups which represent different environmental interests, and which then enforce this law in all these different fields. So there are many rules which integrate these groups, and in practice this means that this way a certain environmental standard is secured. But there is also the possibility to see these processes differently, i.e. that the integration of the civil society could be lowered and have negative repercussions. So there will be new freedoms, but we will have to see in how far these new freedoms will be used and in which way. There could be a lowering of the level playing field, and this would mean that we have exactly those problems which were mentioned in my presentation, that the individual citizen cannot go before a court, because what we have in this agreement is something which cannot be taken up before the courts by an individual, but only by the EU. The EU has become active, and it's a trade agreement, so we have to prove trade relevance in the case of a few standards. This will be very easy, because the environmental standards will have a repercussion on the cost of products, but in other areas, bird protection, for example, it will be very difficult to bring the proof for trade relevance. And the essential elements won't help here, because more has to happen. Because in this respect, not everything which is environmental protection is also climate protection. And there we have an area into which the UK can sink down after Brexit. So if there is a government in the UK which is not interested in environmental protection, it will have after Brexit the possibility to set lower standards or to adopt laws which are bad for the environment, and there will be nothing we can do about it. Well, thank you very much. I see that we're running out of time. I'd like to read out two further questions. And I find it difficult to find these questions, because they change, they move upwards whenever somebody clicks on this. We have here a question by Falkert. What does the Brexit mean for pension insurance for people who have lived and worked in the UK and vice versa? And okay, well, this is the same question I'm seeing here, but in English. Okay. And then we have a legal question, which could be of interest, by Roland Barfus. What happens when partial termination clauses are used? Can you do some sort of cherry picking through that? Or does this put in question the overall agreement? And then another question, which might be for Anna later on: can the Parliament amend the agreement in detail, or can it only accept or reject the agreement in its entirety? And if detailed amendments are possible, what would they mean? Would there be further negotiations after that? Well, this, I think, should be all. Most of the other questions I see here have been answered. I see that there are more fans of Molly. Great. But I'm handing back the floor to René. Thanks. Let's do it by order. Pension entitlements from the past. Well, if there are any, they are covered by the withdrawal agreement. And after the withdrawal, they are dealt with as if the UK had remained in the EU, i.e. the rules of the past remain applicable. if in the UK, well, if you worked in the UK, if you have now pension claims or entitlements, but live outside the UK now, in Spain, let's say, then the Spain pension fund gets the money from the UK and pays it out to you. In the future, if in the future you work in the UK and acquire pension entitlements, then the protocol comes into force. The protocol on the agreement, and it replicates the provisions from EU law, i.e. full protection of pension entitlements, which are portable into other countries, also into non-EU countries. So you can work now from now until 2040 in the UK, then move to Rotterdam because it's so beautiful there. And you can still get your pension in Rotterdam. The same principle, the Dutch pension fund will get its money from the UK and pay it out to you in the Netherlands. Something I've only mentioned briefly are these partial termination clauses. There are different of these. Some of them refer to individual chapters, and the parties to the agreement can use them. But the whole agreement is not put into question if they are called up. But then there are other parts where it is to the discretion of the terminating party in how far it puts into question the whole thing. There is a proportionality principle. If you use these clauses excessively, the other party has the right to hit back, so to say, and to suspend other parts of the agreement. And if you continue this for a while, then the agreement will not be left with a lot anymore. There are parts which are not covered by this right to partial termination, which cannot be terminated. These are individual provisions which you find if you go through the agreement in a prominent place, and this shows also how important they are, is, for example, the protocol for social security. This is one of those parts which cannot be terminated partially as a sanction. So this can be terminated only if you terminate the entire agreement. So the treaty itself, the agreement itself, stipulates what can be done here and what cannot be done. But as I said, if you continue with a lot of partial terminations, then you come to the point where you don't have much in the agreement anymore. But in principle, all these questions are dealt with in the agreement as such. And then the parliament amendments through the parliament in detail, well, we're in the process of ratification. That means that from a legal perspective, the parliament can also only accept it or reject it. However, there are gray areas. The first gray area is that the Commission has numerous unilateral modeling instruments, Partnership Council, for example, or other essential elements, which are very important. Anna mentioned this when she spoke. The Parliament will connect its own ratification to a structural dialogue being introduced with the Commission. So that people can also follow what is going on in these respects. And I think this means that the Commission can also request certain measures in the Joint Committee, not only, as we know from the Legislative Initiative report, with the possibility for the Commission to reject it, but that it can be an obligation to take something over. So the Parliament can amendments with the Partnership Council can apply to the agreement, can propose these, and then can put them to the Commission. And then another question that was raised, what about the sanction rights? And here I would suggest that this should be dealt with in the ratification process if the Commission, these things could be done now, or the trade remedies regulation has this revision clause. This would also be an occasion to take up this right, so that the Parliament could invite the Commission, and that the Commission would then be obliged to initiate a procedure. And I think you should also think about whether such a right to invite should not be should not exist also as to social rights, that the ETUC could initiate, for example, such standards or amendments to such standards when they learn about them. So the trade unions could then play an active role, which could be very helpful. And something similar could be foreseen for other NGOs, which are now recognized partners. There are possibilities, but there are many possibilities to involve the civil society. This as a basic position, as a starting position. And then the Parliament, in this respect, I can say the American Senate has a function for ratifying treaties. There are page-long reports from the Senate which explain how the Senate understands such agreements and how such agreements have then to be applied. And the Parliament could do the same thing, could say divergence with trade relevance, this means this or that, or that this criterion has to be interpreted very narrowly, for example. Try to do that, I would say. And if it becomes a problem, then the Parliament could say, okay, then we'll wait for the revision in 5 years. And then we say the panel practice did not go down well. We have to change things here. And politically, it would be helpful, I think, when if over the year you could build up arguments in this respect, so that the European side could then say what they would change at the status quo we have at the moment. And this moment could then be used for one's own position, for the European position. And the European Parliament could have many requests and could connect them to the ratification. Many points which are politically relevant. Van der Leyen said that she listens more to the Parliament than in the past. Well, if that's true, there would be possibilities. So try to take her by her word. And with this, I'd like to conclude my contribution. I think the most decisive political battlefield in the future will be the question how the Parliament controls the Commission and can make the Commission do the things they deem necessary when it comes to executing the agreement. There are many unilateral possibilities for the Parliament to put pressure on the Commission, and I think it's important that the Parliament looks at what we have in financial services regulations and tax law. These are areas where things can be done without being really dependent on whether the UK agrees with the proposals or not. Well, thank you very much, René. Before I hand the floor back to Anna and to Molly, I'd like to read out 2 more questions we received via YouTube from Friedrich Lennemann.
Generates that much bureaucracy, partial termination possibilities, and denies direct application for citizens. Und dann, weil ich Sie vorher noch angesprochen hatte, eine echte...
And then something I mentioned before, a question from a real baroness, Natalie Bennett.
What would be the composition of any arbitration panel who decides? Would its hearings be conducted in public, evidence be public, and rulings? How is this different if it is to ISDS? And I know ISDS is a favorite of Anna, and therefore I didn't want to spare that. So bye for me, and jetzt rüber zu Molly für ihre Schlussworte.
But first of all, Molly for her conclusions.
Thank you so much, Sven, and thank you, René, and thank you the nearly 800 people who stuck with us through 2 hours. I'm guessing it's mostly Germans that stayed here, but perhaps I'm wrong. No, it's been amazing. I've learned so much, and I really appreciate that. And I'll definitely share the recording, because I think we've learned more this evening than most members of Parliament in the UK know, which is a sad thing, but probably true. So I would say what I've taken away from this is the fact that actually there's quite a lot of cheering news in terms of the environment and climate, which is where the level playing field, at least in theory, looks quite strong. And you can see there are various mechanisms that balance the wish of each side to let the other side down. And I think Barnier has done quite a good job there. I'm much more worried about the tax side of things, and I'm quite keen on the idea of balancing the UK's need to have better terms in terms of equivalence, in terms of access for financial services against performance on tax, which is something I know Sven mentioned, and whether the Parliament can somehow use the fact that we need stronger cooperation on finance to operate similar kind of controls over the worst of the Brexit bad boys as far as finance is concerned. I'm also really struck by the way that there's so many of these new bodies and massive amounts of kind of civil service time and endless negotiations in a sort of non-democratic space, when we had much more efficient negotiations when I was sitting there as an MEP. So, I mean, that's just absurd, honestly. It's just one of the absurdities of Brexit. As is the fact that there's an enormous amount of red tape coming our way now, which we didn't have before. So it's kind of like Brexit's the reverse of what it promised to be. But anyway, I have a lot of information to take away, and I'm really grateful to you for that, René, and I'm really grateful to my dear German colleagues, and it was very nice to spend this evening with you. So thank you. Over to you, Anna.
Ja, thanks, Molly. Und es ist natürlich so, that we miss you a lot in the European Parliament. This we didn't mention today, but all of us, and especially Terry, of course, our colleague Terry Reinke is missing you a lot. Ja, das Ziel des Webinars war ja heute...
The aim of our webinar was to understand the Brexit deal, and I can only speak for myself. I think I have understood now much more than I had understood before. I think the whole webinar had 2 objectives. First of all, one objective for us, the members of Parliament, who have to vote, so that we can kind of consider more what is written into this agreement, but also for all the other people who followed us online, because it has a massive impact on the lives of people in the UK and in Europe. And I think we managed to explain things quite well today. At least I myself feel much better informed now and can look more optimistic ahead. Discussions before us in the European Parliament. René has subsumed this. Again, the question is, what can we do as a parliament? Are there unilateral possibilities towards the Commission we can request? This is what we should focus on now, I think, in the forthcoming weeks. And we should try to forge majorities for this in the European Parliament, because we, the Greens alone, cannot impose these things. There was also the question why the Parliament should sign it. Well, I think I should mention that everything would have been, every deal, obviously, has to be worse than UK membership in the EU. It's worse for democracy. We have now all the different committees, which we've mentioned. It's not good for the people. Also, as to Erasmus, but we as members of Parliament have to take a difficult decision. What happens if we reject the deal? Then we have a no-deal Brexit. So you have to be realistic. René mentioned the red lines that both sides had, the Johnson government too, which they imposed in the end. And well, that's part of such negotiations. They happen in the political space where there are interests of both sides. So with the Greens, we'll now evaluate the text And also with the know-how we have gained today, we will see whether we can adopt the text or not. But we will also have to fight for imposing further things in the forthcoming weeks so that the Parliament makes the ratification dependent on certain requests we have. This is what we should do. And when on the 24th Brexit arrived, von der Leyen tweeted, well, now we have concluded Brexit, we can look into the future. I'm not sure that is really the case with these thousands of review groups and meetings and committees. I think the chapter Brexit is far from being concluded. But let's be positive, and René said this at the beginning. Maybe the backdrop is that in a while we have a new government, we'll be able to discuss things afresh and maybe amend this agreement. And with this, I'd like to give the floor back to Sven. I would like to say bye and thank you all very much. Thanks to all of you who participated today. Thanks to all those who worked in the background, the interpreters, Sven's team, because my team is still on vacation. And well, thank you very, very much. We are going to send you the link with the registration of this webinar. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.